Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Mishal Malik. Mass media is a powerful tool, arguably the most powerful tool of the 21st century. Through this medium, perceptions are made, broken, and molded. But what is ethical role that journalists must play while informing the audience? What are the parameters of reporting? What are the standards that they must follow and apply across the board, irrespective of what color, race, or religion the subject belongs to? What is the role that media must play in interfaith harmony and in conflict? On tonight's show, we explore all these issues in detail. Joining us for this discussion is Mr. Van Magardichan from Paris, who is a journalist and a political commentator. Thank you so much for joining us. Also joining us for this discussion is Mr. Ubeda Hito, who's a journalist from Istanbul. Thank you so much for joining us. Mr. Ubeda, let me begin with you. When we're talking about media and its role, what role do you think it plays during times of conflict?
Media and journalists in general, let's start with journalism. They're supposed to tell people what they can't see, what they can't hear, what they can't know from what's going on in a conflict zone. So journalists are a source of information for people to understand better what's really happening on the ground. And in that way, it's very critical that a journalist delivers that information in a clear, unbiased way. This becomes more complicated when journalists start to take a position, they start to take an angle on a particular situation, on a particular conflict, and they start to lose their kind of unbiased approach to covering the story or delivering that information. They might choose, to deliver specific information or choose to exclude specific information.
Yeah. Mr. Ubeda, so let me ask you this. Don't you think that no perspective is ever truly objective? So how do you think journalists should abide by this standard?
Look, there's a real argument here that you're trying to make, and I'm not going to try and dispel that. What I'm going to try and say here is that when myself, I can speak about my own experiences. When I go to a conflict zone and I see something happening in front of me, I have a responsibility to tell you exactly what's going on, to tell you what I see in front of me, what I hear people telling me about what's happening, what I can hear with my own ears, what I can see with my own eyes, what I can discern with my own five senses. It's not in my purview to make things up or to interpret things in such a way that you might understand them in a wrong way. Now, there are things like, for example, in Syria is a great example. There are things that are happening that people can't confirm 100%. One example of this is like for the airstrikes that happen or attacks that happen from the air. Nobody can really confirm 100% who is conducting that airstrike, who is launching that rocket from an airplane, from a helicopter, and what the source is of that attack. All we know is that a rocket or something happened, it exploded on the other end, and people got injured or killed, in some cases.
So
and this
Mr.
is where
Ubeda,
it becomes tricky.
I take your point there that when you're covering conflict zones, there are many variables that you have to factor in during the reporting. But something that you mentioned here, and I'm going to take this question to Mr. Van, is the responsibility that is incumbent upon journalists while they're reporting to report what they see and what they hear. Mr. Van, do you think in any way journalists are compromising on this responsibility?
Well, I don't think, Michelle, thanks a lot for having me. I don't think the journalists are compromising. I think the way journalists are working in today's world is changing. The way journalists are reporting is changing. In today's world, we have more and more journalists behind screens, behind their computers, behind their desks, than journalists on the ground. We have more and more journalists following news, following events through the social media platforms, through emails, through Twitter, through Facebook, through LinkedIn.
And what is exactly the problem with that?
There's no problem. In the past, people used to. When I first started to be a reporter, all I used to do was spend at least 4 or 5 hours a day, at least, on the telephone, and then at least 2 hours a day on the ground. But there was some kind of a more of a physical, real human connection to it than today's world. Today's world obliges us to be faster. the pace of journalism, the pace that it's asking us to give information faster, who gets the information faster on social media. I mean, I mean, to this point, it's been like almost 10 years. I'm a journalist today. Then I still can't get the idea of how can someone follow up events in a human connection on the ground and at the same time disregard everything else and send out a tweet in a correct manner, not fall a victim to doing a mistake or anything. So there's this space that.
So, Mr. Van, let me ask you this: we are seeing that journalists are subscribing and following social much more. But do you think traditional forms of media play any superior role compared to social media at this point in time?
Of course they do. Of course they do. Whenever I talk to somebody who has just started in journalism, who wants to work and report and become a reporter, I would say, take a few hours away from your mobile phone. Take a few hours away from social media, and try to go to a traditional newspaper and read an article, regardless of whether you agree with the article or not. When a reporter, any person, when they read an article, it's a totally different dimension.
And Mr. Van, that is an important point you make there, that it serves as a completely different dimension. But something I want to ask you specifically is in regards to the Yellow Vest protests. Can you tell us what the grievances of the Yellow Vest protesters are in terms of media coverage? We are seeing, of course, an unjustified attack, but many attacks on journalists ever since the protests began, and they feel, the Yellow Vest protesters, that they are not being covered fairly.
Everyone is rushing into conclusions. Everyone needs to take a step back and relax for a moment and think straight, because what's going on is we're rushing and publishing information without verifying. Basically, we're publishing disinformation on the ground. Whenever I go on the ground to see what's going on with the protesters, what's going on with the protest in general, every time in different scales, there is violence between the police and the protesters. People disagree. Who's starting this violence? People cannot agree on that. Until this moment, we still cannot agree who actually started the fires that struck Paris, the Champs-Élysées Avenue on Saturday, that burned a number of coffee shops and restaurants and stores. So there is disagreement, but it's something regular to disagree. But when journalists, instead of doing a real on-the-ground reporting, instead of that, they go and amplify reports that are circulated online. Instead of reporting, they just amplify and try to take a side. That is not helping journalism today.
Yeah. Okay. So I take your point there, Mr. And I'm going to take the discussion forward and change the topic a little here. I want to ask Mr. Obeda here, when we're talking about the current political, social atmosphere, there is an evident rise in Islamophobia.
And it's obvious that this is a huge problem right now for the United States. There's a huge divide growing in the United States. The Trump administration is having a really hard time managing its messaging to the American public and even to the international public. Secretary of State Pompeo apparently had a press conference, or a press briefing, if you will, on Monday evening, which he invited only religious news outlets to. And then when he was asked, why were these religious news outlets invited and other people or other news outlets not invited, he said that this particular press briefing was specifically about, the U.S. policy in the Middle East and about society and culture in the Middle East and the U.S.'s role in that particular aspect of it.
Mr. Obeda, sorry to interrupt you here, but I do want to ask you, do you think that the gatekeepers of media somehow propagate these views because they get them more eyeballs?
Well, in 2016, if Rupert Murdoch was saying that Muslims need to kill off their own people in a tweet that has been going around social media today, it's getting some kind of viral momentum. Rupert Murdoch apparently said that Muslims should take care of their own problem before they can be accepted as, acceptable members of society. And he is one of the largest stakeholders of the mass media corporations in the world today. Then there is a very deeply rooted problem in the media industry. And I don't want to cut short or sell short the media industry. I work with a lot of top-of-the-line journalists here in Istanbul, people from all over the world that have worked in many newsrooms all over the world. The issue here is with something, I think you could call journalistic ethics. If people are committed to this kind of set of journalistic ethics, they want to tell the truth, they want to tell people the real story, what do they see, what do they hear, and let the viewer, let the consumer of this information decide what position they want to take. If journalists would stick to that approach, and there's an editorial policy that ensures that everyone is following this kind of approach, I think things would be much better. But when you have anchors who are given a platform like Fox News to spew this kind of bigotry, that's when things get out of hand and people are misinformed. So,
Mr. Ubeda, you made a very interesting point there where you're saying when anchors are given that platform, and this is a question I want to take to Mr. Van here, when anchors are given a platform, or not even anchors, but individuals in general, to show that a channel or a media organization does not follow a certain bias, and they will give perhaps for a right-wing extremist, they will in turn give the platform to a left-wing extremist. Do you think every person deserves a platform, even if that means they're inciting violence?
Well, of course, to begin with what happened on Fox News is pretty much exactly what journalism should stay away from. Why journalism is being heard is because of exactly what happened on Fox News, what we saw on Fox News. But luckily, Fox News took the proper measures and sanctioned the presenter, or the host in this case, who's pretty much, as you said, I totally agree with you. She thrives on this messaging. But look what's going on today. Sadly, 10, 15 years ago, what we used to, decide Fox News and isolate Fox News and say it's a terrible way of journalism, it's a terrible work, etc., etc. What we're seeing today is a lot of other television networks are copying the manners, the methods being used on Fox News by some presenters on Fox News. I have to defer that I don't totally agree that Fox News is entirely that way. There are some programs that are moderated in a quite good manner. Some programs are very informative, and then you have programs that are quite literally hurting journalism today. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't allow freedom of speech. That doesn't mean we should sanction and go after opinions or views that we don't agree with. Once we start down on the path, there is no end to that. We are going backwards on that. If we're going to start sanctioning people just because of their views and not giving them airtime because we disagree with them, then we're not contributing to the public debate. We're not giving anything to the world, to the people to understand, to have a sense of diverse understanding of an issue.
Yeah. And I take your point there. Mr. Ubeda, I want to ask you, do you think with all this happening and that we are clearly seeing that certain stereotypes are being propagated, do you think that the wider international audience is losing their trust in mass media?
I don't think that the international audience is losing its trust in mass media. I think it's looking for alternatives. It's verifying and double verifying and triple verifying information that they're receiving. Now there are multiple sources of information.
But doesn't that reflect a trust deficit if they have to verify constantly the information from the source that they're receiving?
No, I think this reinforces the accuracy of information. So if people are going to hear something in mass media, in print journalism, or even on TV journalism, and they follow that story, I think that shows initiative and it shows responsibility. I think that means that we are engaging a generation of international media information consumers that want to know the truth, that want to seek out information for their own purposes. They want to know whether what they're being told is accurate. it or not. And I think this is a good thing. It's a healthy culture to have in the media
Greater
industry
engagement.
when people are checking each other, and it engages people like you're saying, and it forces people to be part of the conversation and not to just be receiving the information and to be, if you will, let me use this kind of loaded word, brainwashed by what they hear.
Okay, so Mr. Veda, hold on to that thought. I do want to come back to that conversation, but we're also joined by Dr. Yahya Al-Aridi, who is a political expert. Thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Yahya, let me ask you this. What are the issues in covering conflict zones, specifically when we're talking about Syria, when it comes to the media? And what are the ethical parameters that must be kept in mind?
I would say first that the media's job, and television in particular, and these days what the internet is doing, one of its goals, be it purposefully or unintentionally, is to program people's minds towards a specific goal that needs to be achieved. They can portray something negative, positive, neutral, and unfortunately, objectivity is not that of an effective feature in what they present. Look at the Syrian case, for instance. Sometimes they take care of it. They put more hours, more minutes into the characterization of what is happening. However, sometimes they turn a blind eye towards something very horrible happening.
Yeah.
For instance, Syria is devastated. Half of the country is destroyed. Now, these days, people have
Dr. Yahya, in these instances, you have mentioned here how there is a negligence and how there is turning a blind eye to the conflict that is happening. Can you tell us what should happen? What is the correct way to go about it? What needs to be corrected in the international media mechanism?
Well, I believe if the media is to serve human beings, those 7 billion people around the world, they should present facts about what is happening and turn these facts into morals and lessons so that they would not be repeated. Now, a country of 23 million people shouldn't have 500,000 people in jail and some of them dying under torture. The media should press into penetrating those graves and tell the world about them.
Yeah.
They should dwell on portraying the devastation happening in terms of destroying half of the country, the displacement of half of the population. Now, the media pays attention to little things. Sometimes there is a little accident somewhere where the victims would not exceed, the number would not exceed 5 or 10. Now, hell turns loose and the media focuses for hours and hours on that. Whereas in Syria, you have cases in millions, in hundreds of thousands of people. Those are human beings. We believe
Dr.
that the
Yahya,
media...
I'm sorry to interrupt here, but why do you think that there is such a disproportionate portrayal of events?
I think it has political strings attached. Now, such a dictatorship that we got in Syria has extended all sorts of intelligence services to those who control the media in the world, and the Syrian people were not given justice to clarify the case and to present it in an objective and in a truthful way. Now, what is happening really now? This, for instance. Now, when Russia uses the veto in the Security Council in order to protect a tyranny, a dictatorship, when this dictatorship uses chemical weapons against its people, now the media should focus on all the details about this Russian horrible action in protecting criminals. Now, this is one important thing we need to draw the attention to on the part of the media.
Yeah, that's a very important point you made there. And Mr. Obeda, I want to ask from that, what do you think happens when there are partisan media outlets out there? And what do you think, how do they impact conflict and harmony, interfaith harmony?
When there's partisan media outlets and sources of information that get into the international discussion and international media discussion, it basically affects the narrative. And one perfect example, like Dr. Yahya was referring to, is the situation in Syria. The narrative at the beginning of the war in Syria was that there was a people who had engaged in a revolution against a dictatorial regime, and the Assad regime with its allies managed to change that narrative. With the appearance of Daesh and other kinds of terror groups, they managed to change the narrative of the conflict. Bashar al-Assad from Damascus stood on the podium many times claiming that he wasn't actually fighting his own people. He was fighting terrorists that came from around the world to come and destroy the country, which is not what was happening on the ground. What was happening on the ground was that fighter jets and helicopters and soldiers of the Assad regime were killing people and destroying homes and destroying lives. But because of the Assad regime's ability to change the narrative in the international discourse, the international community is now more focused on deciding on how they're going to move forward after the terrorists have been defeated and how they're going to rebuild the country with the same.
Mr. Obeda, I take your point there, and I want to ask Mr. Van in regards to whatever that has been stated. Do you think that forms of print media and electronic media are equally impacted these days in this time by partisan leadership, by political leaders? Or do you think in one way, one medium is better than the other?
Yes, unfortunately it has. What has happened in the past 10, 15 years is that print media has suffered significantly because of the rise in the online free media. When the print media started to suffer from this, the advertisements started to get away from print media and go away somewhere else. When the advertisements went away, the money went away. When the money was not there, there was something else that took its place. Now, the print media and with it, every print media's online platforms follow what we call the heartbeat of the online readers. What the online readers want to see, what the online readers are cheering about. Take, for example, the Washington Post. The Washington Post is one of the world's most important newspapers today. It has a global outreach.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Mr. Van. Thank you so much, Mr. Obeda, for joining us. Thank you so much, Dr. Yahya Al-Aridi, for joining us. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to discuss this further. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. While we carry our discussion forward regarding the role of media in conflict and in harmony. Now we're joined by Ms. Anuradha Bhasin, who's the editor of Kashmir Times, joining us from Jammu. We're also joined by Mr. Asad Hana, who is a media expert joining us from Istanbul. Mr. Asad, I'd like to begin with you. We've been talking earlier about how there are so many platforms of media now existing. Do you think media plurality is good for social cohesion? Do you think it's good for harmony? Or do you think it can be even more destructive?
Actually, it's playing in the two tracks. Like, it's good because with the social media, we are going out of the normal taboos of the journalism and of the TVs and the radios, which was existed many years ago and is still like controlling by rules. But with the social media, you are taking someone, usually the people who are seeing what's going on by their eyes. So you are taking the news from the people who are on the ground. You are taking some activists and some media sources from the normal people who can be like without any agendas, without any agendas controlling their work or their news, which is going to the social media. But at the same time, also the social media right now with the propaganda campaigns, which was very active during the last years. It's sometimes faking a lot of news, preparing a lot of propaganda.
So, Mr. Assad, hold on to that thought. You mentioned here how there have been several propagandas being spewed all over social media. But something that I want to ask Ms. Anuradha here is that social media is one thing, but we're also seeing propaganda being spewed all over mainstream media, especially after the Pulwama attack. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I think you're very right. It's happened more after the Pulwama attack, but the propaganda by the media started much before, especially in the context of Kashmir, I would say, started much before the Pulwama attack, and particularly the Indian electronic media. And continuously on prime time, every evening, certain time is dedicated to demonizing and vilifying Kashmiris. In the discussion programs, through the news and views programs, through fake news, which is now no longer circulated by social media, but also by professional media. And I feel this to a greater extent because Kashmir is something it has become a bone of contention between India and Pakistan for many years, and this puts a compulsion on Pakistan media to compete sometimes in coin.
Yeah. Ms. Anuradha, you mentioned here how fake news even slips into mainstream media. I wonder here, what is the editorial policy doing then? Because the difference between mainstream media and social media should be that mainstream media has editorial policies to filter out all this fake news.
Yes, definitely. Unfortunately, it's the money that is controlling the media industry, particularly the electronic media, where the entire focus is on revenue generation without actually investing. I mean, once you've collected enough revenue, so what are you doing to contribute to journalism? We don't find anything of that nature happening, at least in most of the television channel programs. There's very little research. There is very investigation of news. It's all based on views and news studio dramas that end up being noise shows on a daily basis. And I think that is extremely worrying. Yeah. On the other hand, there is a bit of print media which is playing a responsible role, and particularly now the digital media. There are some very good magazines, web magazines and web portals and web newspapers that have come up, which we can credit for very good, healthy, investigative journalism. And
Ms. Anuradha, I take your point there, how that is helping investigative journalism and is portraying a good side of journalism. But I'd like to ask you in regards to the specific situation in Kashmir right now, following the wave of violence against Kashmiris, against so many killings, how do you think it is being covered in the media now? And what do you think needs to change?
I think the media is still not giving a very correct picture. It's a very one-sided picture. On the one side, there is too much, everything is being covered from the perspective of security, and where the only victim is the man in uniform, and whether it is the border conflict or it is the conflict in the interiors. And other than that, it's only about the security issue, the law and order problem. There is very little reportage on what people are going through on a daily basis. For instance, there's been a custodial killing today, and not much coverage do you find in the national media of such incidents.
Ms. Anuradha,
the way...
What you're mentioning here is the lack of a human angle being upon by journalists. Do you think it is incumbent, it is the responsibility of journalists to give a human angle to the stories they're covering?
I think not just a human angle. They need to be covering all angles. You know, if there is an incident, there is only the official version of the story. And in that official version of the story, often the Kashmiri, the local population, are often demonized. And the journalists, in fact, go a step forward. The newsroom, the television studio journalists, especially, go a step forward in saying what going beyond the official story and adding more spices to that.
And Ms. Anuradha, you keep reiterating that the Kashmiri people have been demonized. Can you just take us through how exactly are they being demonized?
Look, I mean, for instance, when youth come out on the streets to pelt stones, so do we have a context about why they are coming out to pelt stones? What are the reasons compelling them to come out? What are the protests about? And what is happening in the background? There is nothing to that end. So there is that huge difference between the stone pelter, the gun wielding militant, the terrorist. They are all being obliterated. Anybody who's marching peacefully, all these lines are getting blurred by the media.
Yeah, and that's a very, very strong point you made. Mr. Assad, I want to ask you in relation to this. When we're talking about how language is constructed in media, I'd like to refer to something, a post by Daily Mirror, which talked about how this recent shooting in Christchurch in the mosques, how they described the shooter then, which was by saying he was an angelic boy who grew into an evil far-right mass killer. But when we compare that to something that happened earlier, in the shooting in Orlando, it was described as ISIS maniac kills 50 in gay club. Can you tell us exactly here how language is playing a role to mold perceptions?
Yes, exactly. Actually, I tweeted also about this, and I talked about the same topic with many other media. That especially for the Daily Mirror, they like here they are trying to show the humanitarian side of that terrorist killer who attacked the mosque in the last few days, and when there was another attack by ISIS, or also there is another covers for the Daily Mirror showing another attacks like they are terrorists, they are just killers, they just kill the people. But here with that terrorist, the recent one, they showed him in very nice photo with his son or with his baby and saying how a human being he is. So here
and what
they
is
are
the problem with
take,
that here?
It's not a problem. The problem is the two faces of the same news. Like they should take this side or this side. They cannot complain about someone, or they can show the humanitarian side of both of them, or they can not show. Like we are talking in the journalism rules, they should be on the same distance from the two news and from the two criminals. If we agree that both of them were criminals, so they should take the same distance from both of them. They cannot show that that was a humanitarian, a good father, and then he turned to be a killer, and the other one to show that he is 15 years old and since he was a child he was a killer. So they should take
Assad,
the same.
Here doesn't that highlight a biasness towards those who belong to the Muslim faith and those who do not, and especially those who belong to the white community?
That's what the accounts and that's what the people on the social media say, that because he was a white person, so they showed his humanitarian side, and the other one because he was from like not white person, they showed him as a terrorist since he was born. So it's kind of biased, as you say.
Yeah. Stay with us, Mr. Assad. I want to also welcome another guest to the show, Mr. Intizar Khadam, who is a journalist joining us from Kabul. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Intizar. Mr. Intizar, can you tell us the media's coverage and portrayal, and I'm talking specifically about Western media outlets, of the war in Afghanistan, the situation in Afghanistan, the people?
Well, thank you very much. Let me divide the media in Afghanistan on three categories. One is mainstream media, which is nationally managed in Afghanistan. There is a lot of TVs. People watch that. And there's then social media, which is very dominant factor in making the mindset of the public, also influencing the political processes in Afghanistan, including politics, peace, governance, security, and all these kind of things. And then the Western media, which is a big factor. For example, if there is any report or any analysis by Washington Post, by New York Times, by New York Examiner, then that will have a big impact. Even the Afghan politician, the top leadership of Afghanistan will heed that. They will listen to it. They will take care of it. And they are scared of the impact which will have on their political structure in Afghanistan. So, of course, we are just a developing state. For the last 18 years, there's not been any media, but we just recently started. Every person is addicted to it. Old generation in Afghanistan, and whether they are political figures or maybe they are tribal elders, they regularly watch TVs in their reading papers. But the young generation who are just crazily addicted to social media, the Twitter use and the Facebook use are the big two side of social media, and that really connect some social political issues to the political leadership in their decisions. So, of course, yes, we're here in Afghanistan and we're just experiencing this new phenomena.
Yeah. Mr. Intizar, but when you're witnessing how the coverage of the Afghan people is in Western media, do you think the portrayal is fair and accurate?
Well, I do not know. Sometimes some Western media are fabricating stories. They're just making up stories in Afghanistan for their political interest. For example, if the United States of America would like to just curve or drive any political process in Afghanistan, they would just let Washington Post or maybe New York Times or any favored media to the policymakers of the United States, and they will just throw a curving ball to the society, and then everybody in Afghanistan will be talking that. I'm not sure if all the time the Western media will have a fair coverage. I'm not sure they're accountable and transparent in covering many stories in Afghanistan. But I understand one thing which I understand is the impact. They have a very inclusive impact, and sometimes it's true, sometimes it's cooked up. So let's not say it absolute, but sometimes it's fair and sometimes it's not.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mr. Intizar Khadim, for joining us and talking to us about this. Ms. Anuradha, while we talk to Mr. Intizar about the situation in Afghanistan here, I wonder, how does media impact policy making there in Kashmir? How does it impact policy making in India, if at all?
I think media does play a role in impacting policy in India. In fact, media has become a potential tool in the hands of those who are ruling, especially, and it's become extremely pliable in recent years. And the same goes for, because there is a certain interest that New Delhi has in Kashmir, and it uses media to, in a great way, to fulfill that certain interest. The media portrayal of Kashmir and Kashmiris is dictating the course, in the sense that it is getting larger legitimacy of Indian public opinion, of the kind of hardline, muscular policy being followed in Kashmir.
Ms. Anuradha, since you mentioned the hardline, muscular policy being practiced in Kashmir, I wonder, with this government that came into power in 2014, the BJP government, do you feel the narrative in the media regarding Kashmir has significantly altered or changed?
It has become more and more hardcore. It had started, this kind of a media discourse had started in around 2008, when the news channels started coming up in a big way, and they were looking at their TRP ratings, and the more noisy that they were, they claimed to have bigger TRP ratings and so on. So that kind of a trend was in the making, but it was never as brazen as it is now after 2014, when it is very easy to target Kashmiris at a time when even Indian Muslims are being targeted. So the Kashmiri Muslims are being seen as a complete outsider.
And take your point there, Ms. Radha Bhasin, and thank you so much for joining us and talking to us. We also have another guest joining us, Mr. Qadir Siddiqui, who is the editor-in-chief of Al Amin News, joining us from the UAE. Thank you so much for joining us. Mr. Qadir, let me ask you this. What would you define good coverage of conflict as being? What do you think are the necessary requirements of ethical coverage of conflict?
Thank you very much for your call and taking me on board. So let me tell you one thing. It is nowadays the media is totally changed. And as far as the social media is concerned, and the channels are there, and the print media is there, so it's a very big industries now. So, for example, if you guys are doing anything in a small volume or big volume, it is circulated within a few seconds. So the responsibility is a basic part. So whoever is reporting...
Mr. Qadir, let's move on to traditional forms of media here, because the debate regarding social media is that it's unregulated. But with regulated forms of media, what do you think needs to be done in terms of ethical reporting of conflicts?
Yeah, this is what I mean to say is, the basic thing is the person who is reporting to you, we have to check whether it is coming from the which source. And either we are going to just create a panic, or either we are going to serve the society. So these 2 points are very important. So once some news is generated or something happen any corner of the world and it is coming to us, and we have to make certain stopovers to stop circulated wrong information or mis-speculation. So as you said, that in this media, we have to make a proper channel.
Mr. Qadir, you make a very important point there, that there must be a complete halt of fake news spreading, of disinformation spreading, because that has caused many propagandas in the past and will continue to do so in the future if we don't take a hold on it. Thank you so much, Mr. Qadir Siddiqui, for joining us, Mr. Asad Hana for joining us, Ms. Anuradha Bhasin for joining us. Thanks for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow. Goodbye and take care.